There's no better way to get back into the swing of things than with an easygoing shooter that doesn't demand a ton of its user. There are all kinds of choices for players to re-enter the shooting landscape with after an extended absence, and one title in particular is Vector Strain, which was released to Steam in December 2015.
Vector Strain is a shooting game that stands out primarily for its flashy visuals and nifty morphing ships, but it's also one that novices and veterans alike can really get into. Let's take a closer look.
On the outset of the game, players have the choice of 3 ships to take on the game with. There are also 2 additional unlockable ships as well, which can really add to the overall replay value of the game. 2 players can also take on the game at once, adding a pretty cool defense dynamic, which we'll get into shortly.
Controls are mostly simple. Players have access to normal 8-way control via several inputs including keyboard, controllers, and mice, which in particular feel pretty imprecise. On a controller by default, the fire button is mapped to the R trigger, bombs mapped to A, and a shield mapped to B. Any of these functions can be mapped to any other button, of course, so triggering any of them efficiently to a player's taste is simple and effective.
Certain enemies will drop power-ups, which increase a player's shot power. With each one collected, their ship will have a module added, which changes how it looks. These power-ups are plentiful enough that both players can have a fully charged ship by the end of Stage 1. If a player is hit though, these power-ups will be knocked off and will need to be recollected, and even then, to a smaller level.
Sometimes it'll seem like there's a dense, impenetrable wall of bullets that just can't be avoided. In times like these, engaging your ship's shield will nullify enemy fire, but at the cost of energy, which is displayed in an orange gauge. In 2-player games, this technique can also be used to defend another player if it looks like they might bite it, and you can make it to them in time.
Of course, your handy bomber attack is also useful in a crowded situation, and with plenty of drops in every stage, liberal use isn't discouraged. However, each craft in the game also has a different bomber attack with timed or local bullet cancelling ability, so care can sometimes be required.
Vector Strain is played over the course of 5 stages, and while the beginner mode is pretty much a cakewalk, normal and above makes for a more aggressive, faster-paced game. The addition of Steam achievements, unlockables, and multiple loops also makes for a game that will last for a long time, especially for achievement hunters and high-score chasers.
The only problem is that Vector Strain is a bit on the dull side of things. Building your ship up is pretty cool stuff, and the shield is nice, but the gameplay mechanics are very stock otherwise. That's not to say that the gameplay is bad though, quite the opposite. It's just not especially engaging, some bullet patterns notwithstanding. Thankfully, playing for score makes up for a general lack of spice in Vector Strain's core gameplay. For its lack of complexity in gameplay, Vector Strain's scoring is, well, yeah, not too complex. Most of the player's score hinges on enemy destruction, bonus point pickups, multipliers, and even score based on how far the player has traveled, which isn't much more complicated than it sounds.
Destroying enemies and keeping the destruction coming will boost up a player's multiplier to a maximum of 8 times. Meanwhile, many enemies will also drop pods that will add to a player's score. Easy.
However, there is one added score type that is tallied up at the end of the stage in question, and that's shield points. Nullifying enemy bullets with the shield can net a pretty healthy score if it's done a lot. Because the shield is time-based and not damage-based, taking huge dense swaths of bullets out can really boost this score.
Of course, other score points at stage end can also boost a player's score quite high as well, including shield points, destroy points without dying, and points based on collected pods. All of this also factors into a 5-medal performance gauge as well. Of course, many achievements are also score-based, and online leaderboards make squeezing every last point out of Vector Strain moderately enjoyable for those that dig it.
One of Vector Strain's main claims to fame, particularly on its store page on Steam, is its presentation. Boasting about gorgeous visuals and an awesome soundtrack is only mostly right though.
Visually, Vector Strain's design is pretty decent with some cool effects, nice texturing, and the kind of 1080p 60 frames per second engine you want to see from a modern shmup boasting 3D visuals. All in all, the in-game stuff is pretty great, with varied stage design and some really slick player design.
It's just not quite up to par with other indies we've seen so far like Astabreed and Revolver 360 Reactor, which also boast some truly insane design, detail, and quality. The enemy design also leaves a bit to be desired, with fairly boring foes that never really pop. Some visual effects also end a little too abruptly. The UI can also be really confusing if all you're using is a controller, since the small, barely noticeable wave cursor animation is only barely noticeable. Bearing this in mind, be sure to make all of your selections with the mouse, just to be sure.
The sound is also a little on the tame side. It's all well composed enough, and the performance works really well throughout, but it also lacks the kind of urgency a shooting game really needs to make it feel like it has a good pace, even if the stages poke along at a slow pace, which Vector Strain does, in all honesty.
The sound effects are also a bit on the bland side too, although the voice samples for pickups do a great job in the game proper. In some cases though, large explosions are sometimes a bit jarring and get cut off, particularly with boss fights and with bomber attacks. It all more or less averages out to a decent overall quality, but it's nothing earth-shattering either. On the plus side though, a cool matrix on the right-hand side of the screen in single-player games shows what achievements are left to get, and options also exist for Tate-style gameplay.
All in all, Vector Strain comes off as a simple, playable game that doesn't try to do too much. Keeping it as pure as possible is great for novices and for getting back into things, but how does it really stack up? Let's take a look.
Vector Strain controls sharply enough to get the job done nicely, unless you're using a mouse.
Control remapping is recommended to really get the most out of all your ship's commands, though.
Vector Strain derives most of its challenge from heightened difficulty and multiple loops.
This makes for a good game for novices, though.
There's a lot to do in Vector Strain, from multiple loops to achievement hunting.
But its slight inherent blandness makes for a less engaging time.
There are some great effects in the environments for sure, but the bland enemies and visuals here don't have the polish that some games like Astabreed do.
At the very least, though, 1080p 60 FPS gameplay is easy to hit on a lot of rigs.
The sound, too, is underwhelming.
That's not to say it's bad, it's just way too chill most of the time.
Outside of a really neat evolving ship which does nothing for the gameplay, and a neat shield mechanic which, honestly, was done better in Eschatos, Vector Strain is extremely basic.
It's very, very by the book for sure, but sometimes that's just what the doctor ordered.
In the end, Vector Strain is a moderately fun title that, again, can easily fill the need to play something simple and, dare we say, is a little mindless. Vector Strain gets a 3 out of 5. You can get a copy of Vector Strain on Steam for about $6 US.